Welcome back to the last presentation of today. We are very glad to have Samuel Moyn among the panelists, and now the turn has come to Sam. Samuel is a professor of history at Yale University. He has written several books in the fields of European intellectual history and human rights history, most notably The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History from 2010. His most recent book on the subject of human rights is entitled Not Enough, Human Rights in an Unequal World from 2018. Sam has been in the center of the debates about the origins of human rights and the transformation of human rights in the 20th century, which defined the first wave of the human rights discussion, as we referred to in our introduction. Moreover, his more recent interventions on the relation between human rights, neoliberalism, and inequality has attracted much attention. Last but not least, while his most recent work is on North American politics, war and peace, and humanitarianism, he has also written extensively on French philosophy, including some of the most central figures in the French debates on human rights. After the presentation by Moyn, we invite Lena Halldenius to offer her comments. But first, we would like to invite you to begin your talk, Sam. Thank you.
I thought it would be useful, I mean, more or less all I could do to just provide a retrospective without any nostalgia about some prior pre-anarchic period, more just what I've tried to say for what little it has been worth. And really how in my own mind, I've clarified my own intended, argument about the promise, but especially the limits of human rights politics of the present era. So with those provisos, I'll just launch in again, very informally, and look forward to Lena's comments. So what I thought I'd do is focus on two books that have already been mentioned in the introduction, and mention a third that's not exactly about human rights, but that resonates in thinking about a different body of norms and law with the arguments I've made about human rights. Those two books are The Last Utopia and Not Enough, and the third is a book coming out in the fall in the United States and next winter in Europe about American warfare in the age of so-called international humanitarian law. So, I wrote The Last Utopia as a, much younger person, different person in 2008 and 2009 on leave as a kind of experiment, and mainly because there was a new attempt to discern on a professional historical basis what the origins of human rights were. And my intuition was that there was something left out of the emerging historiography, that it was focused too early. And though we did not have the virtue of Google Ngram at the time, I used the primitive tools I had available to me in 2008-9 to register a fact that Google Ngram has since confirmed in every language it tests. Sadly, that excludes the Nordic languages, which you should complain to Google about. And that fact, namely, is that at the very least discursively, relative to any prior usage of phrases like human rights, the rights of man, or indeed rights, there was an explosion in usage in approximately the decade of the 1970s. And I've I've never claimed that at root this involves some kind of conceptual alteration of the meaning of the notion of a natural or human right, which is held in virtue of being human. But I have claimed that within modern times, there was a break. And what I tried to do in the last utopia was mount a case that this break was relatively late and massive, and that historians building a historiography of where human rights as we know them came from should take account of this break. So the book is structured as a series of essays, investigations of earlier periods than the 1970s, and then of that moment, to try to understand what was happening to account for what this kind of Google Ngram subsequently confirms in all languages attests. Now, as I've said, I perhaps mistakenly, although the arguments have gained a lot of traction, in the first instance, the focus of the last utopia was on a chronological or dating problem. And that's because for the very simple reason that the bulk of the literature and, let's say, the emerging public consensus dated human rights very differently than I felt matched the available evidence to me. On the one hand, of course, there were debates amongst historians of, let's call it, thought, some of which John's alluded to, that debated whether the Greeks had a concept of a right, whether the Roman concept of rights was allowed for something like human rights, notwithstanding this, the Stoic contributions, whether the Middle Ages were characterized by the correct understanding of rights, or whether it was only because of these later medieval events that the true, let's call it, subjective notion of rights was born, or whether, in fact, the conceptual breakthrough occurred in the early modern period. I basically didn't concern myself with any of that. I'm very interested in it, but I was interested in the debate amongst historians about the modern period, about when the concept of human rights, whatever its vintage, became politically explosive, and indeed in two different, and I argued opposite ways. First, grounding states and justifying sovereignty, and later providing the basis of a new kind of international claim making and governance. And the arguments there really concerned the era of the Atlantic revolutions and the 1940s, almost to the exclusive of every other period in modern times. And I wanted to try to craft an argument that took account of those periods, but especially looked forward to an alleged transformation of some kind in the 1970s. Now, as I've already suggested, this couldn't be a conceptual history alone, maybe because it seemed obvious to me then, and it does now, that at some level of abstraction, nothing changes. But it did really matter to tell a history of culture, ideology, politics, and there I wanted to take what I believe left out of many accounts, including, say, Lynn Hunt's on the Atlantic revolutions or Marianne Glendon's on the 1940s, take account of movements and the reception by the public of those movements as pivotal constituents of the rise of human rights, and really that that methodological move, if you like, allowed me to change the dating in ways I was concerned to do. So what briefly was the story I came up with? It's funny that I am an American, and I've often been denounced by critics for Americanizing human rights history, but actually my own belief always was that the French Revolution was the central and remains the central event in modern times. And what I wanted to do in both this book and the book I'll talk about shortly, Not Enough, was to make the French Revolution central and award it a pride of place in defining, let's call it human rights 1.0, the first politics of human rights. And what I argued was that in these kinds of events, which continued across modern times, rights were cited as a justification for violent revolution and the building or rebuilding of sovereign states. That was the role they had played in the backwater, revolt against empire in what became the United States. And much more importantly, it was what occurred in different stages of the French Revolution, especially the early and middle part. In this regard, I was inspired by some figures who I'm just going to mention. In regards to the kind of early modern period, I was deeply inspired by a French figure, Marcel Gauchet, as well as an Englishman, eventually a Harvard professor named Richard Tuck. Not his early work, which was really, I don't know if John would agree with this, pretty derivative of Michel Vili, but his mature work in books like Philosophy and Government. Both these figures, Gauchet and Tuck, argued that we must think of the rise of rights in the early modern period, first as natural rights and later the rights of man, in connection with the rise of new powerful states. And so it was wrong to think of modern rights as a kind of libertarian conception. Rather, they went along in a way that figures like Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, were open in making analogies with the rise of a new kind of state, including absolutist state. And the analogy for the individual in the state of nature was precisely the state in the international order. And so I really wanted to emphasize that for a long time, rights claiming and statehood building went together. But more than that, I was inspired by Hannah Arendt and her belief in the normative centrality of citizenship politics. Now, the funny thing was that she prized the American rather than French Revolution, and she famously rejected the politics of statehood and sovereignty in favor of her own bespoke conception of citizenship politics. But decisively, in her critique of the French Revolution, she developed the idea that the citizenship politics of revolutionary agency should be conceived of as different than, distinct from humanitarian pity. And I tried to basically make her argument, but argue that rights were a central modern form of citizenship politics, and indeed most inspirationally in the French Revolution, which Arendt, for bad reasons, dismissed as just a festival of pity. I then tried to argue that this first form of the politics of human rights 1.0, was dominant for a very long time, and indeed through the middle and of the 20th century, when the process of decolonization of European empire could be seen as a globalization of human rights in and through the globalization of the state and sovereignty form. It was on that basis, really, in a form of backlash to or response to decolonization, I felt originating in the global north that human rights 2.0 were born, not after World War II, which saw the strengthening of sovereignty and its globalization across the world to the ends of the earth, but in response to what folks in the global north perceived as the horrors of decolonization. What happened when people of color got to govern states, that human rights 2.0 were born. And this was a different form of politics, as I tried to cast it back many years ago, departing from the same concept of human rights, however old it is, but different in a series of ways. First, it was critical of the state, especially the third world state, and critical of sovereignty, indeed insisting on installing rights protection, possibly through state consent, but possibly not, in international governance in ways that could justify the monitoring of sovereignty at a global level. It also prominently involved the rise not of solidarity with fellow citizens as the central form of modern politics and indeed of rights politics, but rather the politics of pity that Arendt had located in the French Revolution, especially pity across long distances, where human rights got defined in their dominant forms as a politics of suffering at a distance and what the wealthy and typically white do about it. And I tried to present evidence that, this was what was at stake in the human rights revolution of the latter part of the 20th century, and confirmed in the Engram and the massive spike in very use of that phrase. You could also note a change between human rights 1.0 and 2.0 in the salience of violence. In the first politics of human rights, the whole point of citing your human rights was to justify picking up a gun and rebelling against government. That's what revolutionary human rights were, a justification for violent insurrection. And of course, decolonization involves some of that to throw off the yoke of empire. But human rights 2.0 purged violence and became associated with new mobilizational forms that weren't just about the appeal to trans or international sources of rights authority, but also involved new kinds of mobilization that featured prominently things like naming and shaming, lawsuits, the wealthy donating to give, some life to their pity beyond just the emotional state of feeling bad about suffering others. Now, in The Last Utopia, I worked with a distinction between morality and politics as one distinction that might help us get at the shift between the first and second forms of the politics of human rights. Now, here I was inspired by Wendy Brown, by her brilliant old article, The Most We Can Hope For. But I also wanted to show that as a matter of actors' categories, in the 1970s, when prominent advocates for human rights talked about what human rights were, they said they weren't political, that human rights were about an incontestable morality that was above politics. And I stand by that descriptive point, that it's really significant that that's how a series of dissidents and others, most prominently someone like Václav Havel, talked about their politics. Now, of course, I understood, maybe I wasn't clear enough about this, that this anti-politics is, of course, a politics of a certain form of politics that is self-denying or dares not acknowledge that it's political. But it's crucial to, I thought, to grasp that this is how that form of politics worked in the emergence of human rights in this second age, our age of human rights. I was attacked by lots of people for this kind of distinction between morality and politics. I think I wasn't clear enough that I thought that morality was a politics too, and that we really have to kind of compare it to other forms of politics. And I also entirely concede that, in part because the last utopia really does end around the year 1980, that the distinction, whatever it was left vague, and there wasn't much clarity about what might constitute a political alternative to the morality, so-called, of human rights. There was a fair bit of nostalgia in the last utopia for the French Revolution and its, eventual decolonizing successors, but not much, let's say, normative clarity about what kinds of politics might be worth reviving in an era characterized by the reign of human rights, anti-politics, and in the mode that I've just been kind of trying to clarify. Now, amongst historians, there were some other arguments, lots of other arguments, which in this group I don't cover just because we're not talking about history here, as far as I know. One of the main claims, I think most recognizable claims of the last utopia, is that the Holocaust was not the reason why the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was propounded, which has caused its own set of controversies. I've also been criticized for neglecting non-dominant or subaltern visions of human rights at various points in history, but most notably, the forms of human rights that the decolonization project allegedly itself put forward. I don't want to get into those controversies here, but if people want, I can return to them. Another quite interesting controversy that I had a view about at the very beginning, as I've described in mentioning Arendt, but has only kind of become more discussed lately amongst historians, is whether we should disentangle human rights from humanitarianism as historical categories to think about their trajectories. As I've said, I always thought that human rights did refer historically to domestic politics within citizenship settings, whatever the cosmopolitanism of the idea of human rights. Whereas humanitarianism could very early allow long distance identification and politics, but typically not in a rights framework, much more often in a Christian or imperial framework. And that it's only in the recent period that human rights got entangled with humanitarianism. But there are a lot of different views about that out there, and there's a recent edited volume by Michael Barnett that pursues this one. The main, let's say, conceptual debate, I think, was inspired or enabled by my very vague usage, as I've said, of this distinction between the morality and the politics of human rights. So let me interpret what I've done since as an attempt to not abandon, but specify that original distinction in order to, characterize our moral culture and our political culture of human rights in the recent period and the era of human rights. Now, just mention, since I wasn't sure if John was going to mention it first, that I did give some lectures about how we should think about Christianity and human rights. While I did try to marginalize the 1940s as a big moment in human rights history in the last utopia, I think to the extent we look at that moment, we have to acknowledge how Christian it was. And I subsequently gave some lectures on that. Many of the arguments I've given in that regard have been overturned, so I don't don't want to dwell too much on that embarrassment. Rather, I focus most of my energies on some unfinished business in The Last Utopia. Now, the ironic thing is that I wrote The Last Utopia right at the time this financial crisis was happening. I had taken a year of leave from my then, institution, Columbia University, and was in Princeton, New Jersey. And I wrote The Last Utopia, and I kind of had my head buried in the sand because I must not have been paying much attention to the news, because the main reason I would fault The Last Utopia in retrospect is that it leaves out political and economy and distributive justice from its narrative. It's a historical study of the evolution of modern politics without any reckoning with the significance of economics and distribution to those politics. So when I had the chance to rewrite The Last Utopia, I decided to focus selectively on those topics and try to tell a different, although I hope not oppose narrative to the one I'd given before. And if you like, the entirety of my work in Not Enough, which came out a few years ago, it is really trying not to just postpone human rights to the 1970s, but to correlate them across the modern period, taking account of their recent salience, but correlate them with the much greater salience of campaigns for egalitarian justice, and especially socialism, which, as you can see, Google allows us to show, again, in all languages, was far greater in prominence than human rights for the longest time, until, as if these two things were fatefully connected, socialism begins to collapse or crater at just the time in the middle of the 1970s that human rights begin their alarming ascent. And indeed, the lines cross in 1989 with the end of the Cold War, clearly a big moment. And so I also wanted to go on beyond 1980, which is a very early date to end the history of human rights. And so I also hoped in Not Enough to expand the chronology, not by fighting with people over the Middle Ages or the early modern period or the revolutionary period or the 19th century or the 1940s, but around the 1980s and especially 90s and how we might think about those. So the main claims of Not Enough are about how to think about the evolution of human rights and movements around them in relation to principles of distributive justice. And I give roughly 3 periods in this version of the story. The first is largely in agreement with Karl Marx, who, at least on the Jewish question, I think was right to, maybe for the wrong reasons, but right to think that human rights were the ascendant ideology of the conquering bourgeoisie or middle class. And it was for that reason that in actual reality, rather than on paper, the human rights that existed and were enforced were chiefly those that resonated with capitalist values, so-called, and especially in regards to freedom of contract and the sanctity of private property. If you like, in this version, there was a human rights 1.0, but especially as the 19th century wore on, the first human rights movement was really the movement of the commercial and the propertied. those are the ones who worked hardest to establish their rights, or at least most successfully in dominant governance. But then there was this second stage, the still within Hannah Arendt's, paradigm of citizenship politics. The balance of forces shifted decisively in the middle of the 20th century in the direction of social citizenship. And what I wanted to argue is that this had consequences for rights politics. Of course, none of these arguments took back my claim that the 1970s were the moment of internationalization or the emergence of new forms of mobilization. But they looked much more carefully at what rights politics were about within citizenship politics, at the various forms of human rights 1.0, as I was calling it and talking about the last utopia. And then to look at what happens in this 1970s third moment when human rights existed, emerged in some obscure connection with what we now call neoliberalism. Now, to make the argument, I relied heavily on a concept that I borrow from moral philosophers, although I also tried to give more details about, its own conceptual lineage. It's a distinction between so-called sufficiency and so-called equality. These are possible moral obligations that, what I tried to do is look at how human rights politics in various phases fit with this distinction. Basically, the idea of sufficiency is that in the distributive domain concerning some set of decencies or goods or services, there's some threshold. It's our moral obligation to provide to our fellow citizens or humans. You could hold that obligation exclusively, as Thomas Paine did as the first so-called sufficientarian, that what matters is not how rich the rich are, but whether the poor are taken out of poverty, as he says very, very clearly in Agrarian Justice. And there are contemporary sufficientarians like Harry Frankfurt. But there was this contending ideal, egalitarian justice, which was very much concerned about the whole distributive curve, whether of income or wealth or primary goods or capabilities, whatever. And it's the contention that unjust allocation matters even if the poor are made less poor, and especially it matters if the rich ascend, even if the poor do too, beyond some, threshold conception. And so what I argued in this regard is that in the middle of the 20th century, we can detect that on the basis of some 19th century ideas that went nowhere, we have a new recognition of, let's call them sufficiency rights in constitutions, starting with the Mexican, in international documents like the Universal Declaration and the International Human Rights Covenants of the 1960s, but that this quantum leap for rights thinking was generally correlated at the level of citizenship politics with egalitarian commitments too. And so properly understanding the middle of the 20th century was not to understand a breakthrough for social rights only. It was to understand that breakthrough in connection with an egalitarian welfare project. Now, it still is very important to register how unpopular rights thinking could be for a welfarist project, either for its sufficiency concerns or its equality concerns. And that's because the Marxian and later left liberal critique of rights had been so influential in the later 19th and early 20th centuries. Nonetheless, you did have a consecration of new social rights in constitutions and the Universal Declaration. This didn't mean a new form of human rights politics. It meant a new form of citizenship politics at the level of states. Its backers were socialist parties and trade unions. In continental Europe, Christian Democrats. There were no human rights movements of the kind we talk about. Those were still reserved for the 1970s. But within citizenship politics, it was a major development. And what I wanted to claim was that major development at the level of states was precisely the attempt to canonize sufficiency rights and equality norms together. My witness was T.H. Marshall, who believed wrongly that if you are for social rights in sufficiency terms, you're automatically for equality in distribution. How, after all, could you build a floor of protection without making the rich pay for it, and therefore simultaneously building a ceiling on inequality? It stands to reason if you know very little about economics. But it was a widely shared belief, and it's more testimony to the fact that sufficiency and equality went together in citizenship politics at this stage for white males, who were the really main beneficiaries of these welfare states. If this is all right, then I just have felt that I was doing a better job than in the last utopia with the Universal Declaration. In the last utopia, my point had been it made no difference. It was largely ignored, and I stand by those claims. But we can add that it incarnated a positive project. It reflected the welfare state consensus of the moment it was drafted. That's what it was most basically in historical terms. So if you like, if the UDHR wasn't a response to the Holocaust, it was a response to the coming of social citizenship within states for white males. Okay, then the question is, what happened after that? Well, as I narrate in Not Enough, decolonization did try to take welfare citizenship politics to the end of the earth, as I argued before in the last utopia, through the globalization of state sovereignty. What was even newer about decolonization was that it tried to bring equality norms beyond the citizenship politics where they had been marooned. After all, modern times was mainly the era of the great divergence between the global North and South, and indeed, decolonization worsened global inequality. It's an amazing fact that I think we still really haven't reckoned with in our political thinking. And decolonizers not only tried to globalize the welfare state, but they also tried to transpose domestic norms of equality to a global scale, thereby inventing what we now call global justice, which some Anglo-American philosophers later kind of canonized conceptually, as I try to show in Not Enough. Now, the global South failed in this agenda, but it was an agenda that was coming out of Human Rights 1.0, coming out of citizenship politics, which decolonization globalized, but also trying to change the scale of politics in a different way by taking equality norms, not human rights, or to the global scale, but instead of their vision, a neoliberal one triumphed since the 1970s. A lot of debate, in these areas has concerned what exact relationship we assert between the coming of Human Rights 2.0, the rise eventually of economic and social rights campaigning and the neoliberal era. My own view is not a Marxist one. I'm so sorry that because of the time difference, I couldn't hear Igor's talk today, and I won't hear Jess's tomorrow, but I'll just make a couple of remarks about my non-Marxist view about this. Essentially, what I want to say is that the sufficiency concerns of social citizenship in the welfare state era became unmoored from equality politics in the age of human rights. And that at best, human rights movements, when they got around to concerning themselves with distribution at all, were concerned with building a floor of protection for the indigent or worst off, even as neoliberalism was concerned mostly with obliterating any ceiling on inequality that welfare states had tried to build at the local level and domestic politics. So neoliberalism required the destruction of socialism, but it did not require the destruction of human rights as an ideology or cause. Actually, my claim was that human rights and neoliberalism could coexist in a kind of version of children's parallel play, with human rights working at the level of floors, trying to build them, along with a lot of other humanitarian and development movements, and neoliberalism working at the level of built ceilings on inequality and destroying them, about which human rights movements had nothing to say, because the norms that they pursued were for the sake of sufficiency only, not for the sake of egalitarian distribution. And that makes human rights fit, in my view, with the distributional signature of our age, which not everywhere, but in many places has involved a lot of poverty remediation on a world scale, especially so-called extreme poverty remediation. But in many of those places, both in the global north and global south, an explosion of inequality, about which, again, human rights movements aren't concerned, properly or not. The best example, the starring role in this story would have to be given to China, which simultaneously, in the recent period, under its own version of neoliberalism, has saved the most humans from so-called extreme poverty of any force known to world history, while simultaneously accelerating domestic equality more rapidly and to a greater extent than any place has ever seen it explode in world history. And a lot of places are like this, only just less extreme. So my problem with human rights in a kind of ecological conception is not that they were complicit with this outcome, but that they fit in with it in ways that revealed their lack of ambition. Now, that's not Jessica Whyte's view, and I'm sure she'll talk about it tomorrow. I'll just remark that in her great book, The Morals of the Market, Jess chooses a very unrepresentative human rights outfit called Liberté Sans Frontières to make the claim that advocates of human rights actually liked neoliberalism, wanted to advance it. Actually, I think most human rights activists since the 1970s have been, social democrats in their personal political views. It's just that they weren't social democrats in their politics, and they provided no great support for neoliberalism. It's true they failed to challenge it, working on something else instead. But that's different than a kind of Marxian allegation of complicity or Marxian supposition, at least if on the Jewish question is our concern, that frameworks of partial emancipation have to be removed for so-called human emancipation to be achieved. So, what are the consequences of this argument as I see it? And I should wrap up pretty soon. In relation to the more vague arguments of the last utopia, what I'm suggesting human rights have lacked in the recent period, in the era of human rights 2.0, is their concern for egalitarian justice. And it's not that means we should abandon human rights, but keep them. But as the welfare state did in one mode, and as decolonizing Sears hoped in another mode, build egalitarian justice into our politics. And so I hoped in the title of this second book, Not Enough, to capture my own critique of human rights, which is not that they're bad or wrong, but that they are insufficient. Sufficiency norms in particular are a selective morality. And it may be defensible to have movements that are selective in their causes, but it's not permissible for us to rest content with a selective morality in politics, including domestic and international politics. And so if we keep human rights movements, we should either make them more ambitious or let them do their work while building our own egalitarian movements and egalitarian world alongside them. Just briefly, I've written a new book that's not really about human rights, but it's about the laws of war. It's true that in our own day, there are many who want human rights to be part of the laws of war. My basic argument in this new book coming out is, I'm just going to be very brief about it, that there's a similar syndrome at work in mobilizations against brutal war and calls to enforce the international humanitarian law, so-called since the 1970s also, that has the good but insufficient vocation of making war humane. And once again, my trouble with this, especially as America and its allies have fought the war on terror, is that it's a selective and insufficient morality that is really being promoted in the absence of a more ambitious and pacifistic morality, or at least more pacifistic morality, given that most wars have been fought under false pretenses, make the world worse, and really require us to resist them, not merely how they are fought. So, I hope you read that one too, or if you haven't read any of my prior books, you read my new one. But I really just wanted to mention it because to me, the structure of the argument in it is exactly parallel to the one I've been reviewing, my kind of, considered view and Not Enough. That when we look at this selective international morality of our time, especially as lived and promoted by movements, we can indict their minimalism. It's not that their content is objectionable normatively, but that if lived and practiced selectively in the absence of more ambition, we rest content with too much injustice. And so what I'd like to see is an age beyond human rights, not in the sense that we abandon human rights or human rights movements, but that we put them in their place as selective campaigns that deserve to be, to populate a different ecology in which there are more ambitious campaigns alongside them. In the economic realm, these would be socialist, or more generally, at a global scale, movements for global justice. In the wartime context, these would not just be movements that beg powerful states to stop killing brutally so that they exercise beneficent and humane hegemony. Rather, the hierarchy that is expressed, indeed incarnated in a very sinister way, I think, in contemporary humane wars fought by various countries, deserve themselves to be opposed and not just made humane. And so this is a structurally parallel argument, although it's not exactly about human rights. And it is, I thought it would be worth mentioning because it seems to be an argument that I find most credible after all the controversies that have swirled around human rights in particular in the recent period. So I'll stop there and look forward to hearing Lena.
Thank you very much, Sam, for this very precise overview of your most important books. And also interesting to hear about the debates they've provoked and the book. It seems very fascinating. Thus, I would like to hand over the word to you, Lena. Please.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much for that. Thank you, Sam, for fascinating talk with. And I think that I will do what you did. So I will say a few things, make a few comments, and ask a couple of questions, and then I hope to hear also from other people, because these are such central questions that all of us are grappling with, and it is also the last paper for today. So I would like to include as many as possible. So I think that, I mean, there's so much in what you said in terms of how you read the history from the early modern upwards that resonates very well with my own interpretations. There's not much there that I disagree with. So I would like to pick up on you used human rights 1.0 and 2.0 to sort of identify different kinds of views, approaches, or how human rights politics is played out. And I will use that in order to maybe suggest that there is potential for a human rights 3.0, possibly. So one way of distinguishing between that earlier conception of human rights that you identify with sort of the French Revolution kind of human rights and the late 20th century human rights, I think, can also be approached via sort of different approaches to how we think about human rights in the context of justice. So we can make the distinction, it has been usefully made by other people as well, between thinking about principles of justice as pertaining to systems. So systemic principles of justice, where we assess an outcome of whatever it is, an outcome in terms of welfare, or an outcome in terms of satisfaction or preference satisfaction or whatever, not in itself. So we can't just assess the justice of a situation by looking at the outcome for how well are people doing, but the justice of the outcome has to be assessed with reference to the system that produced it, right? And whereas another kind of more sort of localized approach to justice would be to say that, well, we have a principle, say that regarding distribution, that distribution should be done in accordance with need, say. And then we can just look at people and see if their needs are satisfied. And if their needs are satisfied, then we can say that the distribution is just. And we can say that without considering how this outcome came about, or whether it came about through systemic functionings, or whether it came about through philanthropy or just luck. That doesn't matter to our assessment of the situation. And I think it makes some sense to say that the distinction between human rights 1.0 and human rights 2.0 is that in human rights 1.0, human rights is a systemic principle, whereas in human rights 2.0, it's a local principle. And so in the, if we call it the French Revolution kind of human rights, the concern of thinking about rights is the concern of how to structure a society systematically. Whereas in the version of human rights that we have become accustomed to now, the list mania of human rights means, and the fact that it's merged with developmental thinking, means that we assess human rights on the basis of indicators of welfare. And if that is the shift, then it can, of course, plausibly be explained in terms of other developments. And we can say, like you say, that it has walked pretty comfortably in tandem with the neoliberalism. I agree with you that I don't think that it's about neoliberalism or that it was ushered in by neoliberalism. I don't think that neoliberalism cares about human rights one way or the other. I think that is much more to do with the effect of developmental discourse on how we think about satisfaction of life quality. That is the developmental discourse rather than neoliberalism that explains how this happened. And I think that there are some quite explicit interventions also in the 1990s by Amartya Sen and others, to that effect, that if we want to, and this is sort of a curious backhanded way of how the idea that human rights should be about certain pressing concerns rather than great ideals that are inconceivable, that pressed the human rights discourse, certainly about welfare questions, towards the basic floor, because that is where we can do some difference. That was the argument. So I think that also that I'm sort of also in this context a bit keen to rescue Thomas Paine from the charge of being the first sufficientarianism, since I think that his agrarian justice and the argument that we need to provide for the poor was sort of theorized from within a systemic approach to what rights do. So even though it is about setting a floor for the poor, when he says that he doesn't care about how rich the rich become, as long as no one is poor as a consequence of it, he really thought that people would be poor as a consequence of people getting rich, and that had to do with stealing the land from the general public. So really that is also a critique of Locke and the justification of the enclosure movement. So I think that matters. So also a politics about floors will take it on a different tinge depending on whether it is done from within a systemic approach to justice or whether it is done from a developmental discourse sort of sufficiency, localized account of justice. So maybe it is now the time is perhaps right for rethinking human rights as 3.0, reintroducing human rights as a systemic principle. And I think also that the very interesting research on economic inequality that we have seen now over the last 10 years by Piketty and many others sort of harks back to the critique of inequality that was part and parcel of the 18th century approach to rights. So why is economic inequality a problem? Is it because economic inequality is inherently unjust? No, it is because it tears societies apart. And you can't have a functioning system if economic inequalities are too great, because it also feeds into perceptions and ideas about who is worthy, who is dignified, and I think that is similar kind of arguments that we now see from economists arguing against economic inequality. That's where the critique of economic inequality now comes from, not from philosophy or not even from sort of critical philosophers, but from the friends of capitalism within the economic field, that societies are torn apart by economic inequality, and that sort of prompts us to rethink human rights 3.0 as, again, a sort of systemic principles of justice. And that's why I think that I also agree that human rights are worth keeping, and that they're worth reconsidering, and that but they need to be rethought as systemic principles of justice, rather than placing them alongside an argument about the inherent worth of egalitarianism. So the systemic principles of justice would do it. That was just a reflection on which I guess resonates partly, at least, with what you have said.
So Sam, you want to respond or comment or?
Sure. Although I'm mostly in agreement with Lena, and I'm very grateful for our comments. It does resonate. So I'll just say maybe three things. First, on Thomas Paine. No, I have no stake in the proper interpretation of Paine, just of that sentence. It's only fair to note, of course, that he wrote Agrarian Justice in response to the egalitarian Gracchus Babeuf, and something I may work on in the future is the long tradition of the idea of a lex agraria that would involve widespread redistribution, and Paine wanted to position himself to the right of those proposals, and if your defense of him is that he was, if you like, similar in advance to T.H. Marshall, that he naively believed that providing for the poor would automatically be a form of class justice, then we have to equally concede that he was naive and mistaken. And I think that's what we've learned so clearly in the neoliberal era, that you can help the poor when the rich win, because the pie can increase and we can give more to the poor even as the rich take most. So I would say I don't see much point in rescuing Paine if it turns out the defense really requires us to, attack his mistake, let's say, empirical premises. Okay, I just want to make one thing very clear as a second remark. I intend human rights 1 and 2.0 to be descriptive categories about what people, or most people, or the dominant people believed and did. And you've cast them in terms of, let's say, a normatively defensible distinction between systemic justice and, non-systemic need. Maybe that works, maybe it doesn't. I would say, in my own for my own personal normative, beliefs, that Marx was right, and later people like Charles Bates were right, that after centuries of colonialism and the rise of so-called capitalism, the basic structure was at the world level. It has been for centuries. If there's a system, it's not local, it's global. And so it's a mistake, I think, to divorce even indigent need somewhere far away from the global economic system. If that's true, then human rights 3.0, to turn to like a third comment, can't be politically defended, I don't think, in terms of, let's say, isolating local systems to repoliticize, because they could only be subsystems. Actually, I hate systemic thinking. I think this is the worst thing about Marx and about many others, that the idea that there are indivisible systems that we take or leave and don't tinker with, and that aren't ramshackle constructions, seems very pernicious in social thought. But if there is a system, it's global already and has been long since. I guess I would prefer for that reason to say human rights do some good things as a selective morality, including orient themselves globally to sufficiency violations in a global economic system. But we also should want a bigger update. We don't have to rest content with just providing more updates to human rights. We need to update ourselves so that we place human rights alongside more ambitious frameworks for justice and practices of justice at different scales. So that's probably the only minor difference I can locate between the two of us, but it's against the context of mostly agreement, I think.
Do you agree, Lena?
Yes, sure. So when I say systemic, I don't mean building systems. I mean analyzing outcomes in terms of institutional structures that affect them. So I'm not a fan of system buildings philosophy either. And so I suppose one crucial question for anyone interested in these matters going forward, thinking again about human rights, both philosophically and politically, is how much of a job we want them to do. We can do, as you suggest, that we can say that human rights do some good and we can use them to talk about sufficiency. And then we have other frameworks also within which to embed them, or and in which language we can talk about more sort of ambitious projects. I suppose one challenge with that is that to the extent that human rights continues to frame international discourse, if human rights are made to be about, continues to be about the sufficiency, and particularly when it's repacked in the Agenda 2030 language of a set of 179 indicators that we can tick off, I think that the risk is that human rights will stop doing good and will instead sort of contribute to some kind of measurable race to the bottom. That is my concern about that. Okay, so I would now encourage the other participants also to comment or ask questions.
I see Igor raising his hand.
I'll be quick because I see John and others also have. Just on the Marxist point, I'll make sure to send you the slides with all the biblical references, Sam. But I do want to push back against the claim that political emancipation becomes a barrier for human emancipation. I think that's the error in the interpretation, because there's the decontextualized reading of On the Jewish Question. The point was to defend the equal rights of Jews. So why, in defending the equal rights of Jews, would someone argue that the equal rights is a barrier to human emancipation? But the better evidence for that is Holy Family when he returns to it, and he's very clear who he sides with and who he opposes. But more interestingly, I think instead of positioning human rights on one side and no human rights on another, it's a struggle of different rights claims. And that's in capital, that's in the Law on the Thefts of Wood, which is what I mentioned in the morning. And I would strongly recommend The Dispossessed, which was just translated by Robert Nichols. Ben Said really captures this point and the continuity there, because that gives us a Marx that's with us today. I don't think that many Marxists would actually question, or at least assume that there's some kind of unicausal relationship between the emergence of neoliberalism and human rights. Marxists, I think, are more interested in the accumulation of capital and its concentration, which is what even Piketty gets wrong in the end. So I think if we want to understand why human rights are not enough, we have to understand the history of that concentration accumulation and what needs to be done in order for that to change, to produce a different kind of rights. The 3.0, let's put it that way. Yeah, but I'll leave it there just so others can jump in.
Thank you, Igor. Sam, if it's okay, we can take further questions now, and then you can answer them all together. So I think John, you would like to say something? Yeah.
Unmute.
John, you have to unmute your microphone.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks very much, Sam, and I'm broadly in agreement with your major conclusion. I just wanted to ask you there a little bit more about this question of whether there's a big break in history, which I think is connected with the issue of citizenship that you continuously ask about how human rights is related to citizenship, because you recognize that rights are correlated with the emergence of the absolutist state or the modern sovereign state, and that these are twin developments. And you also recognize that with Marx that the dominance of rights is very related to the growth of the capitalist economy. So in both cases, surely these are both absolutely massive shifts. That they're clearly the shift to a market economy, but also the shift to a monopolization of power that involves the destruction of any traditional notion of citizenship as something like a sharing in rule. And it seems to me that traditional notions of rights as well are often linked to that. You have a specific right or privilege that involves ultimately some kind of share in public ruling, because it's not monopolized at the center, so that along with the modern sovereign state, you get professionalization of politics. And that means that citizenship is now defined in a much more private way, that the citizen is not somebody who shares in ruling, but somebody who is the recipient of rights of ownership, rights to do what they like, or also rights to certain benefits, and that can include also sufficiency rights. But it seems to me that in none of this are we really recovering something like an ancient and medieval sense of citizenship as sharing, participating in ruling. And now the big question then would be whether, the French Revolution is recovering that in a new way. But you don't seem to really say, you probably have said elsewhere, how that relates to the 17th century moment. I mean, aren't the French trying to smuggle in also a certain Republican notion of citizenship as sharing in government? But how really authentic is that? According to Marx, it's not really authentic. So I suppose my question is, beyond rights, do you want to recover the classic notion of citizenship as participation in government or not?
Thank you very much, John. Elena, you also raised your hand. And I ask you to keep it quite short since we're running out of time. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will try to be very brief. Thank you, Samuel. I just wonder, what would you say? Would you say that egalitarian projects, egalitarian human rights projects are defeated for all future? I think of, for example, non-discrimination principle and anti-racist movements. It seems to me that not least due to this, let's say, victory of non-egalitarian human rights discourse, I anticipate a reclaiming of human rights by those who are really reclaiming human rights as egalitarian project. Would you say that? I realize that any historiography is someone's story, but would you say that there is no future for egalitarian interpretations and struggles over the human rights? Thank you.
Thank you, Elena. And Sam, you can take into account that you will also have a chance to come back tomorrow in the concluding discussions.
Exactly, and I may save some, further discussion with John for then, because John is on panel.
Yeah, that would be totally fine. Yeah.
So because I think that would be interesting. I'm very much interested in connecting rights to an overall account of human flourishing and thinking about what kinds of participation in the exercise of power that might require, and distinguishing that from an entitlement sense of human rights. So just to Igor briefly, and then Elena briefly. I defer to your Marxology, Igor, and I'm very sensitive to the fact that even on the Jewish question might need to be distinguished from Marx's other writings, but also his later practical acts, which included, advocacy for certain working men's rights. I would say then that my critique is of Marxism as it's been often interpreted. And I think at times correctly, because it does seem that Marx was indentured to a conception in which the bourgeoisie had set up a certain so-called capitalist economic system, which first had its own laws of development, which would lead to its overthrow, and second would require system substitution. I mean, if that's not what Marx thought, it's certainly what Marxists have believed. And there, I think we can argue that, we're for human rights and that they would survive such system substitution. But if that's true, I mean, we still have a lot of argument about whether it's credible to think in terms of such systems, and therefore in terms of something called capitalism, and in relation, whether it's credible politically to think that the goal is overthrow and system substitution. And I don't. Elena, I should have been clearer that in this work, I've distinguished analytically between so-called status and so-called distributive equality. Now, I hasten to clarify, I don't think this is a normatively defensible separation, that whatever our view of status, distribution has to be built into it. But human rights movements have been part of a neoliberal era, especially in this regard, that often status equality has been separated as a formal matter from distributive concerns. And this is one of the problems, I think, with human rights. Now, it could be overcome, but human rights law does verbally guarantee status equality in the form of non-discrimination, but it's not linked on paper or in practice to distributive equality. And in many countries, we've seen a phenomenon where, as a result of anti-racist and feminist struggles, people are much more equal in some terms, let's call them status terms, even as the rich amongst the victim groups ascend relative to the rest amongst the victim groups. A good example is women in most countries, who are more equal to men than in the past, but rich women are less equal to the rest of women than in the past, distributively. And the same is true of, say, African Americans in my country. There's a Black 1%. So we need that analytical distinction precisely to save human rights from this, let's call it neoliberal syndrome, which has involved a status egalitarianism that is divorced from distributive concern. And if we healed that, we might make human rights radical, but it doesn't seem like that's going to happen unless we have radicalism on its own, namely distributive radicalism of the kind that has died in the era of human rights.
Thank you very much, Sam, for the talk and the response, and thanks to all the panelists for posting questions. Also, again, thank you everyone that has been listening to the different talks. We can't see them, but we know that you're there. And again, I would like to encourage all of you, because of course I know that you have a lot of questions as well. So I would like to encourage you to send your questions by email, the same email address that you registered for the symposium, and then we will pass them over to Ola tomorrow, so that he can use them in the concluding discussions. But now I think we all have to rest from Zoom and maybe from other things as well. Do you want to say something more before we end? No. Okay. I hope to see. I mean, I'm sure we see each other tomorrow, but also everyone has been listening now. I hope to see you tomorrow as well. So thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.